und Sinne und Sinne und Träume und denk an die Liebste mein. So scheu und quirlen wie Nebel zusammen und kichern und huschen vorbei.
My name is Chris Thorogood. I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Science for the University of Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum, and we're delighted to be working with the Oxford Leader Festival. We're standing in Harcourt Arboretum in Newnham Courtney, a few miles from Oxford city centre. This beautiful site comprises 130 acres of woodland and meadows that originally were part of the Newnham Park landscape designed by Capability Brown. In 1949, the University of Oxford purchased the Newnham Park estate from the Harcourt family. The estate consisted of the house and surrounding parkland and farmland. In 1962, much of the area was sold except for 5 acres reserved for use by the Botanic Garden in the city centre. Over the last 6 decades, the Arboretum has extended and includes many kinds of tree that could never have been grown in the garden alone. Today, the site has a 10-acre English woodland that is a veritable lagoon of bluebells in the spring, a 37-acre wildflower meadow home to a kaleidoscope of butterflies in the summer, and an 8-acre pinetum that contains some of the finest and oldest giant redwoods in the UK, like this one. The site also has a serpentine ride commissioned in 1835 and designed in the picturesque style by William Gilpin. It really is a very beautiful place to spend time, and never more so than during the autumn months when the vibrancy of leaf colour of so many different types of tree makes it a botanical experience without compare.
My name's Kate Kennedy. I'm a writer and a broadcaster fellow at Wolfson College, Oxford, and I've just finished writing a biography of the poet and composer Ivor Gurney. He was a Gloucestershire lad. He was born in 1890 and he died in 1937. He was caught up in the generation whose lives were ruined by the First World War, and he fought in the trenches at Ypres and the Somme. In 1922, he had a breakdown so severe that he was certified insane and spent the rest of his adult life, 15 years, locked up in an asylum. All that time, he kept writing and composing fantastic work, although much of it is still unpublished to this day. It's a tragic enough story for anyone, but for Gurney, there was a particular level of harshness to the circumstances of his life. All that time in France, and later incarcerated against his will, he was separated from the landscape of his native Gloucestershire. He didn't just love nature, he lived it and breathed it. The landscapes of home were essential to his very survival, and he wrote his music and his verse to honour them. He was a personality that was uncontainable. It was as if people weren't quite enough of a match for him, and he turned to the countryside, the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, the daffodil meadows and the orchards by the River Severn for his companions. He found separation from them unbearable. As a teenage boy, he had been the assistant organist in Gloucester Cathedral. One day, he was stuck up in the gloomy organ loft and he saw the light fall through the stained glass. The thought of how beautiful the river and the meadows must look in the sunshine was too much for him. "Oh, God, I must go to Framelode," he exclaimed, and disappeared for 3 days. Gurney was a man to whom conventional rules seemed not to apply. Before his incarceration, he would work and walk at night, at times sleeping in barns or by the sides of rivers. When police tried to move a hunched figure from his improvised bed on the Thames embankment, they found they'd apprehended not a tramp, but a scholarship student to the Royal College of Music. And whilst he was a student there, he wrote the song Sleep. It was to be his most enduringly famous work, and it holds the listener spellbound. It's a cri de coeur, a profound expression of longing, written with the weight of the knowledge of what it meant to yearn for an escape from suffering. But it wasn't all doom and gloom for Gurney at this early and hopeful stage of his career. He was still only an undergraduate, and one with huge promise, already recognised as one of the most talented composers of his generation. Sleep is one of a set of songs, which ends with a burst of sunshine. Even as a young student, Gurney had already experienced despair, but he was also equally familiar with the joys of spring, both the season and the song. And both sorrow and joy have their place in his words and music.
So I'm Kate Saunders and I'm a psychiatrist based here in Oxford. So around the time Gurney composed Sleep, he'd returned from London to Gloucestershire to recover from what we would now describe as a depressive episode. And his choice of poem is notable, really, given the central role of sleep and in his own mental health. And there's a lot of descriptions of him going days without sleeping when he was more unwell. It's also really striking the role the countryside played for him in his recovery, and that really can't be underestimated. It was a theme that was present throughout his life. And the countryside really represented a fundamental part of his self-identity, a place where he found solace, he found creativity, and indeed connectedness. And it was a place that offered him enormous hope and comfort. And actually more recently, we now know that green spaces do indeed convey very significant mental health benefits. They're associated with feeling less distressed, with less anxiety, and in fact they may even improve people's ability to deal with stressful events when they occur. And there's also all of those indirect effects relating to being outdoors, things like exercise, there's less pollution, and indeed the experience of greater social cohesion. And all of these things we know to be beneficial for mood. And interestingly, in those diagnosed with mental health conditions, green spaces seem to have a really significant impact. They seem to reduce anxiety, depression, psychotic symptoms, and clearly have a really important role to play in recovery. And it's interesting, actually, in the 21st century, we're beginning to see this getting incorporated into the design of new hospitals and the way we think about the spaces where we deliver therapy, such that we can take advantage of the fantastic sort of natural environment that we have around us. So having recovered and returned to London, Gurney wrote to his friend Will Harvey about this particular piece. And he wrote, "Dear Willie, it's going, Willie, it's going. Gradually the cloud passes and beauty is a present thing, not merely an abstraction poets feign to honour. Willie, Willie, I've done 5 of the most delightful and beautiful songs you ever cast your beaming eyes upon. They're all Elizabethan, the words, and blister my kidneys, bicurate my magnesia, if the music is not as English, as joyful and as tender as any lyric of all that noble host. Technique all right, and as to word setting, models. Orpheus, tears, under the greenwood tree, sleep and spring. How did such an undigested clod as I make them?"
Come, sleep, and with thy sweet
Our mission at Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum is to share the scientific wonder and importance of plants with the world. The unique mosaic of woodlands, coppices, meadows and ponds here at Harcourt Arboretum houses a diverse range of rare trees and wildflowers. It is also home to fungi, animals such as deer, badgers, bats and owls, and also dragonflies, beetles and amphibians. Together, the diverse habitats here provide a protected reservoir for biodiversity that is at risk across the UK. So this site is ideal for connecting audiences from Oxfordshire and beyond and deepening people's engagement with nature. But a decline in environmental awareness and disconnection with nature are symptoms of a growing societal problem described as nature deficit disorder. Plants in particular are a blind spot in the human psyche. Although we owe our very existence to plants, unlike animals, many of us scarcely even seem to notice them or see them merely as a green backdrop, a phenomenon described metaphorically as plant blindness. Now this is worrying because today an estimated 1 in 5 plant species is threatened with extinction globally. Fostering greater environmental care and awareness of the importance of plants and nature is one of the routes to tackling this crisis. Here at the Arboretum, we have many beautiful threatened and endangered trees from across the globe, some of which were wild collected by our own arborists. Because people tend to connect with animals more than they do plants, we've introduced a threatened tree trail that enables people to take a rare tree safari. Here we compare the conservation status of each one with a well-known animal so that people can calibrate easily just how rare and special these trees really are and why their conservation is so important.
In the trenches of Flanders and the Somme, Gurney tried to hold himself together with thoughts of the countryside back home. Gloucester became, as he called it, a city in the soul, and the landscape he loved became a talisman, internalised, deeply rooted in his being, an image he could turn to save himself from mental disintegration. We can hardly imagine the kinds of sights he saw on the Western Front, but at one point, faced with a ravaged no man's land that had until recently been woodland, he cried out to his friend in a letter, "You cannot think how ghastly these battlefields look under a grey sky. Torn trees are the most terrible things I have ever seen. Absolute blight and curse is on the face of everything." His response to such desolation was to try to replace the sight of the shattered landscape that surrounded him with images of the lush woodland of home. He was countering the destruction of warfare with memories, hideousness with beauty. But his tragedy was that even as he tried, he knew that the images of his imagination were no match for the devastation that surrounded him. Ultimately, he was forced to realise that not even Gloucestershire and the trees he loved could save him from breakdown. Trees by Ivor Gurney. The dead land oppressed me. I turned my thoughts away and went where hill and meadow are shadowless and gay, where Cooper's stands by Cranham, where the hill gashes white show golden in the sunshine, our sunshine, God's delight. Beauty my feet stayed at last where green was most cool, trees worthy of all worship I worshipped. Then, oh fool, let my thoughts slide unwitting to other dreadful trees, and found me standing, staring, sick of heart at these. Gurney wrote reams of poems whilst in the trenches, including one of only 8 short lines. It was a little farewell note of a poem, a modest plea that if, as he expected, he would never return, then the landscape at least might remember him, and his special relationship to it as its faithful observer and adorer. Only the wanderer knows England's graces, and can anew see clear, familiar faces. And who loves joy as he that dwells in shadows? Do not forget me quite, O 7 meadows. Do not forget me quite. It's such a quiet, understated little request. Shortly after he'd written it, he set it to music, calling it 7 Meadows. There's something sublime about this song, this total synthesis of intention, his two voices, composer and poet, intertwined. It rolls and gently undulates like the Malvern Hills, as the wandering voice meanders among them, the piano finally trailing off unobtrusively into thin air.
So war zones, and especially those that Gurney experienced on the Western Front, really couldn't be further from the idyllic landscapes of Gloucestershire. And it's really interesting that throughout his time in the trenches, he used imagery of that landscape to cope with the very, very sort of difficult situation he was in. And actually, we know that imagery plays a really important part in mental well-being, and particularly in situations where physical access to the natural environment may not be possible. And increasingly, there's a technique called guided imagery that's used to help people manage difficult emotions. And that's where you work with a therapist to bring certain images to mind. And it's actually fascinating that when you do that and bring these internally generated images to mind, they actually evoke the same sorts of responses within the brain that you would expect if you were experiencing those for real. And so actually they can induce the same relaxation and sense of calm that you might experience from being in the natural environment for real. And actually there's some evidence to suggest that guided imagery, which is specifically nature-based, may in fact be superior in terms of its impact on well-being. And fascinating to think that Gurney, sitting there during World War I, was actually using a technique that we now know to be a very evidence-based part of the care that we provide.
The world is experiencing unprecedented transformation in terms of its climate and population growth. Plants provide all human food, either directly or indirectly, as well as the clothes we wear and the medicines we take. Our future depends on their very existence and their sustainable use. Botanic gardens and arboreta such as this one have a unique opportunity to promote this message through education and engagement. But gardens and arboreta are not only places of learning through connection with nature, they are places where people can find spiritual and mental well-being. Over half the human population lives in cities, and this trend towards urbanisation has reduced people's access to and engagement with green spaces. Yet there is evidence of a positive relationship between the levels of exposure to green spaces and mental health and well-being. Yes, in a frenetic world, urban gardens and arboreta like this one are not only a sanctuary for biodiversity, they provide much-needed green oases of calm. They are places of human healing.
One day, on the Somme, during the miserable summer of 1916, Gurney erected a makeshift shrine in his dugout, an altar at which to worship Gloucester. In place of an icon or a crucifix, he wedged a photograph in a niche in the sandbagged wall. It was a picture of Gloucester Cathedral, the river and the fields around it. The sepia image represented, in his words, a place that stands for delight with all Gloucester men. It means a good tea, clean air, feminine society, a good row on a pretty stretch of river, beauty and leisure to enjoy it, home and all its meaning. He'd created his own shrine to the landscape he adored, and he intended to make his worship a communal act. But what would his congregation make of it? Would a photograph of Gloucestershire indeed stand for delight with all Gloucester men, however homesick they might be? It seems unlikely, but when he showed the Gloucestershire soldiers his little picture postcard of the fields of home, they were profoundly moved. As Gurney reported in a letter home, "I lead weary men into this commodious residence and show them this pennyworth of poor printing. They cannot speak, or do so in such phrases as, 'That hurts my Corey,' that's Gloucestershire for soul. 'My God, what a life,' or more explosively, 'How long is this war going to last?' Gurney survived, only to be locked in mental asylums for the rest of his life and forcibly separated from the countryside that nourished him. Vaughan Williams visited him regularly with his wife Adeline, who found it unbearable that Gurney's life was being prolonged against his will. Surely it would be kinder to let him have one day in the Gloucestershire hills, she said, even if it did mean that he killed himself, rather than to keep him alive but a prisoner. During his years in the asylum, Gurney's very identity was under threat from an institution that defined him only as patient number 6,420, noting with suspicion in his medical records that the patient is said to be musical. In an asylum, even your achievements can be recorded as symptoms of delusion. Nothing is safe. Definitions and boundaries were things Gurney strongly resisted, and in his fight against anonymity and in defiance of the institution, he insisted on defining himself by his own set of designated titles. First war poet, and a soldier and a maker among them. Recreating the landscape of home in his music and verse became all the more important as it defined who he was. He lived simply to imagine and reimagine his countryside. The tiny details became all the more vivid in his memory. Wet leaves, sunsets, the rise and dip of the paths between the hills, the sounds of the River Severn. For hours, he would trace on a map with his finger the routes he used to walk, reliving every moment. 4 years after Gurney had been imprisoned, and shortly before he was to stop writing poetry and music forever, he wrote a poem called Soft Rain. It's one of many, remembering the security, the warmth and homeliness of the landscape he loved, and its musicality is so vivid and evocative that it's hard to believe he knew he would never again be at liberty to roam his fields and woodlands. Soft rain beats upon my windows, hardly harming. But by the great gusts guessed farther off, up by the bare moor and brambly headland, heaven and earth make war. That savage toss of the pine boughs past music and the roar of the elms here come in the candlelight, soft reminder of poetry's truth. While rain beats as softly here as sleep or shelter of farms. However dreadful his situation, Gurney recognised that it was his very instability that allowed him to see more clearly. His life was a painful negotiation between inspiration and mental anguish, but it was a struggle he knew on some level to be unavoidable and even essential to an artist intent on forging new forms. And at the very centre of it all, and of his fight against the inhumanity of war, against institutionalisation and ultimately madness, was the landscape that inspired and defined him.
So at the time that Gurney was put in an asylum, there are actually very few active treatments available to him. And it's interesting that he was deliberately placed away from Gloucestershire and away from that landscape that he took such solace from. And as a result, he refused to go out into the grounds of the asylum he was placed in because he said, this isn't my landscape, this is not what I'm familiar with. And it's interesting to think about whether if he'd been placed nearer to home, perhaps he may have been able to find some solace and get better. It's also interesting that we know now that natural landscapes do play really quite an important role in recovery, and particularly among people with PTSD, so people coming back from war zones. And if you ask them what is it about the landscape that aids that recovery, they talk about this sense that actually wild places offer up no judgments, they don't make any demands, and they place no expectations upon you. They often describe gardens and outdoor spaces as being places of refuge and safety, and places where they can be much more grounded, and by that I mean being present in the space, taking in all of those things around them, rather than ruminating and being distracted by imagery or thoughts of traumatic past events. And it really highlights, I think, the importance of being able to access these sorts of spaces, both in hospital environments, but also more widely. You know, we traditionally have this model of seeing patients face to face in a room, and in fact, maybe we should be doing some of those consultations outside. Confidentiality aside, actually walking with someone through a natural landscape may be a much easier environment to talk about difficult content than doing it in an enclosed space where there is that expectation and pressure upon people. And I do hope that actually as we evolve services that we think much more about those wider aspects of the environment that we can use to enable people in their recoveries.